Hey, Aspies and ADHDers, it's Reed from Inside the Asperger Studio. Today, I'm joined with Melissa Doman, a sleep specialist for the Neurodiverse. So please check it out and make sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for more notifications when I put up new videos. I'll catch you on the other side. Talk to you guys. Hello, Aspies and ADHDers. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Asperger Studio. I'm joined today with Melissa Doman, a sleep specialist for those who have ADHD and ASD or any other type of disability. Welcome to the show, Melissa.
Hi, thank you, Reed. Thanks so much for having me.
You're not a problem. So tell me, how did you get into becoming a sleep specialist?
Well, I guess, day job, I guess you could say. I work as a child brain developmentalist, and I've worked with kids with special needs for 12 years now. And when I first started working with families one-on-one in that realm, the one question parents would constantly ask me is just like, what do I do about my child's sleep? And at first I had no answers for them. So, when you get that question enough in the office, it's like, okay, I got to do something about it. And, ultimately that brought me to sleep training and good sleep hygiene and, just using my knowledge with child brain development and looking at all these things about sleep. Ultimately I kind of put all of that together, and that was 6 years ago now, 7 years ago.
Okay.
That journey started, and I am fortunate enough to say that I've worked with hundreds of families and teenagers and young adults at this point, and helping them just rest better.
All right. What would you say is the most important aspect of getting a good sleep?
I think it kind of depends on the age group we're talking about. That being said, I think the two things that always tend to, in my opinion, like really get in the way of a good quality night's sleep is usually around bedtime, and that is regardless if it's children, adults, whoever. But another thing that people have to really take a close look at and evaluate is just exactly how much screen time they're getting. And these are not like groundbreaking recommendations in any way. It's more just like being mindful of it and making a concerted effort for, several weeks to really make changes in those regards. And I think a lot of the times, my parents and the adults that I've worked with, that takes them 50% of the way there, just those two things. So making sure that you're getting to bed at a time that is right for your body clock, and, being mindful of when you turn off your cell phone or your screens, before bedtime. It can make a world of a difference for the whole family, really.
That brings me to my next question is, do you think that adults and children both have a hard time putting down their phone or even their tablet? I know I have a hard time doing it because for me, I know I can't read at night because at a certain point, my mind shuts off. I need something to relax me.
Yeah.
I have a blue light filter, but do you think they work as well? To add on to that question.
Yeah. I think blue light filters help a little bit, but it's still, especially for the population that I work with, like that blue light filter only gets so far, and there's still that blue light that's coming in from the screen can really overstimulate the brain. And I've worked with a lot of kids where it's like just a few minutes of screen time before bed helps them to relax and calm down. But like what's happening underneath and what's happening at that deeper level is just their brain is still thinking like, oh, it's daytime, which it can affect how long it takes for them to fall asleep. But even if they fall asleep right away, I'm guaranteed to see that they'll wake up multiple times a night. So it's a matter of finding what are those things that we can do to replace that screen time, even when that does feel like a comforting, like relaxing thing for us or for our kids.
Now, do you feel meditation is a helpful thing for sleep?
It depends on the person. And I say that just because I am one person who has tried for years and years and years to do meditation. And it's like pulling my nails out. Like it's really, it's really hard for me to get that shut down and to have that like focused present, 10 minutes or so. So it can be really helpful for people, and I'm not knocking it. I just know that it's not always like the easiest thing to do. So, my recommendation is that like, if you're a person where your mind's just kind of going all day long, it may not be before bedtime, which is the right time. It may be like first thing in the morning, just to have a little bit of focus and being present. For me, what I do instead of meditation at night is I literally just like write down all my things. I write down my schedule, my checklist for the next day. And I have a little notepad by my bed as well, just in case I forgot something. And for me, that works so much better than meditation, but that's just me. And, I've had plenty of families and adults I've worked with where meditation was great for them. So, I think it kind of depends on your own personality and what works for you.
Now, have you dealt with any clients who have racing thoughts or like a really active mind at night, who just have problems shutting it off?
Sure, absolutely. And again, I am one of these people. I mean, my husband jokes all the time about like, I'm up at 2 a.m. I'm like, oh, I got to write that down, write it down. But for me, like, and having used this tool myself and having recommended it to enough clients at this point, like that alone, just sometimes having that reassurance of like, okay, it's down, I'm not going to forget it, is enough to say like, okay, let's settle back and let's focus on trying to get back to sleep here. So that, for anybody who tells me that they're just constantly thoughts racing, going through the day, everything like that, just write it down. And this is even something I'll do with my kids too. I'll have parents, set aside 5-10 minutes towards the end of the day where we write down the things that were really tough, were maybe really stressful, but we always end off with a few positives. So anything that could be bothering that kid, this is an amazing tool. And I've used this with so many of my kids with ADD. It's a game changer in a lot of ways. You just have to do it consistently.
I'll have to try that out. Just keep a pad of paper beside my bed and just start writing down any thought that comes into my head.
Yeah. But again, I think there's something symbolic of like, regardless of how big or how small that thing is, just writing it down. It's like, okay, we've acknowledged it. It's out in the open, right? It's there. But I think you have to be, at the same time, you have to be a little pigheaded with yourself to say like, we're writing it down, but that means we're handling it tomorrow. This is not the time to do it. Whatever that thing is.
Now, how do you deal with clients who have insomnia? Because I know that's even worse than racing minds, is they're constantly trying to battle sleep and their mind just won't let them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, if somebody comes to me who's been truly like diagnosed with insomnia, like sometimes it takes you have to take a deeper dive into some other bigger things, like the nutritional component, the physical activity component. And of course, I have training in all those things and I'll give those recommendations. But, in certain cases, like you might have to go to somebody who's really specialized, like in some of these like deeper rooted things. Like sometimes like with insomnia, a very specific like supplement regimen or dietary changes, like, you'll want to go to somebody specialized for that. But for somebody, for my clients that I've worked with and families that I've worked with where somebody has a true insomnia, like sometimes just getting the bases covered with like a very simple, consistent physical activity regimen is a big thing. And making sure that there are some basic nutritional changes can make a great impact on that too. And if it is like 2 a.m. and you're just up and you're like, I don't know what the heck I'm supposed to do with myself.
Yeah, me.
I have my clients write out like 3 or 4 things, which are their like, don't just lie there techniques. So, something like just leave the room, go sweep the kitchen floor, or, organize the spice rack, or something like that, just to keep your mind off of it. Cause there's definitely, I think for a lot of people who struggle to sleep, when you've been lying there for 3 hours, the first thing you're going to be thinking about is like, this is never going to happen. I'm a terrible sleeper. Like, so getting into that negative mindset is not necessarily going to get you sleeping any faster. So you got to do something to kind of pattern break that. So finding like those kind of mundane activities, even if you have to do it 3, 4, 5 times, it's a way to pattern break that and just get off of that negative thought of like, okay, I can't do this.
That kind of reminds me of like what Sleepio had you go through is use that positive reinforcement, and instead of thinking negative,
Yeah.
come up with more of a positive feedback, taking that negative and turning it into a positive.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking like I'm the only one who can't get sleep, turn around and say I may not be the only one who can't get sleep. There are probably others out there who are going through the same problem.
Sure.
So it becomes more of a reinforced positive.
Yeah. And look, I know that there are some people who would think very cynically of that, like, oh, I'm not going to, be telling myself I'm the greatest sleeper in the world at 2 a.m. Like sometimes you have to pick a statement that is true. So like, even if it's like, eventually I'm going to fall asleep, like that doesn't sound super positive, but if that's something that you can believe in, like, hit your card on, like, go right ahead, like start with that. And, little by little, as that changes and as you do get to be a better sleeper, that mantra or that thing that you tell yourself can adapt and change with it.
Interesting. Now, would you recommend like CBD for those who have problems with sleep as well? Because I know I use it almost religiously because it's got melatonin in it. It's not a heavy dose, but it's enough to at least trigger the fatigue feeling of being dizzy and sleepy. But it's like my mind still fights it.
Yeah. Well, look, I think with any of these additional like over-the-counter remedies, like a CBD or a melatonin, ideally they should just be used on a temporary basis. Like, if you're traveling time zones or something like that, and you're having a hard time resetting your clock, or something like really, really stressful or upsetting has happened in your life. And again, if you have that kind of temporary bout of not being able to fall asleep, those things are totally okay. My goal with when I work with somebody is to try and get them off of it, because most of the time people that come to me have been using melatonin for months or years, or they've been doing the CBD and they're still maybe not like seeing the changes that they want. And a lot of times these things are recommended more kind of like as band-aids, but they don't necessarily get to the root of the issue. And I mean, the amount of stories I've heard of like the melatonin or 5 different medications for my kids to try and get sleep. It's like, well, let's maybe focus on those sleep habits. Let's start putting into place some of these things like around bedtime and some of these activities. And a lot of times, like, that's it. That was the root of the issue. And we've been band-aiding it with that melatonin or CBD. So like, of course, I'm not knocking anybody who uses it. Like, when you're not sleeping well, I totally get it. But, sometimes, like I said, it just very often it's, we just kind of, we glaze over what, what some of those bigger issues are and try to find that quick fix. And sometimes it does work, but not always. Yeah.
Now, how do you deal with someone who's having trouble falling asleep? They're constantly tossing and turning and just can't get to sleep.
Well, look, there can be a lot of things that factor to that. And I think the first thing, if we're looking at, an adult, for example, the first thing is just to write down for a couple weeks, like what time you actually fall asleep, what time you actually wake up, because it's very hard for us to remember those things. And once you have it written down, you can kind of observe and see like, okay, are there any trends here? So a lot of times when I have my adults do that, they realize, oh, I've got more of like a night owl rhythm, or actually I should be going to bed a lot earlier. Like not everybody's window is the same. So, I would say look at that first. And then based on that information, can you make adjustments into your schedule to hit those ideal times? If not, very often just like a bump, 30 minutes earlier, 30 minutes later, or an hour earlier, hour later can make all the difference. Now, I would say like most of the time, especially with the adults that I work with, we're kind of just like missing the window. I'd say 80% of us, like our window of opportunity to go to sleep is right around that 10 o'clock time. And for a lot of us, like if we miss that window, it's much harder to get to sleep. Your sleep is more fragmented. And, for anybody who has like a neurodevelopmental issue on top of that, it can just exacerbate it. So like, sometimes it's just a matter, like I said, of writing it down and kind of observing. But, if there's nothing really coming out of that, you've got nothing to lose by trying like that earlier time where, like I said, 70 to 80% of the population is like around that time. And, in my experience, just getting to that earlier time can help things. And it's just because you're hitting that window of opportunity, and it's kind of what Mother Nature's been telling us for a while.
I mean, that kind of makes sense on my part, because ever since I've known it, my body will all of a sudden shut off at a certain point in time, around the 8 o'clock time, where it's like, where I can't do anything. It's like, I can't concentrate. I can't focus. I'm tired.
Yeah.
And it's like, I can't read or anything. And it's like, okay, I just need to relax. And even when I was away at school, it was like I had that time where my mind just shut off, where I couldn't focus or anything. And it's like, and the more I stayed up past it, it's like I'd go to sleep. My body would just fight and fight. And then like weekend, I'd like crash. Friday night, I'd crash. I'd wake up feeling refreshed. But for the rest of the week, I'd wake up feeling like I've been crying all night. My eyes would be puffy and watery. And it was just like, why am I feeling like this?
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, so often when you miss that window, you go into that state of overtiredness where the brain doesn't even know what to do with itself. Like I'm trying to, oh, it went right out of my head. Anyway, but it's kind of like all the bells and whistles are going, but like nothing's working, nothing's in sync with each other. And a lot of times, like my parents, I'll say, when do you actually start to see tired signs with your child? And it's way earlier than than when they're putting their child to bed. And it's like, yeah, that's your window right there. We got to take advantage of that one right there. And when we do, it's much easier for their kids to get to sleep. Everything is just kind of in sync with each other. So yeah, it can make a big impact for sure.
Yeah, I may have to try that once I start to feel tired. Just say, okay, it's time to go to bed.
Yeah.
Now, what do you think is more important to getting a good night's rest? A dark, comfortable room, or knowing when to put down your electronics?
That is a great question. And again, I think it kind of depends on the person in a lot of ways, because I mean, the electronics, especially for adults, it's like you're constantly connected. I mean, like I can in 2 seconds pull up my work email at 10 o'clock. Should I be doing that? No, but there's that like instant gratification or whatever of like seeing, okay, who maybe wrote me or what's going on. And, for a lot of us, I think it just kind of depends, but my vote would be is like, if the screen and that connection is something that like you are just looking at before, even like the seconds before your head hits the pillow, all of that light stimulation and all of that just overstimulation of seeing this person and reading that thing, like it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to always settle to sleep easily. So I'd say like, if I was going to pick the two, I'd probably err on the side of that. But if you're not somebody who is terribly connected to the screens and you've like been really diligent of cutting it off at a certain time, especially this time of year, this is when I usually hear from people saying like, why am I waking up earlier? Why is it harder to fall asleep? And it's like, well, because it's a lot lighter outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your opinions about reading in bed? Either an actual book or a Kindle?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of the backlight. And for the longest time, I swore off any kind of like Nook, Kindle, tablet reader. I do feel like, having a book in bed, like, is a great way to relax and wind down, as long as you're reading relaxing, lighthearted content. Like, I wouldn't recommend like pulling up your New York Times or something like that. But I think if you use a reader, as long as it has like that matte screen, it's not backlit, you should be okay. And again, I got something like that, and I've used it basically every single night since I've gotten it. And for me, I'm very light sensitive when it comes to sleep.
You're like me, actually.
Yeah,
Okay.
and these are actually blue light blocking glasses. I wear them all day long just because I don't want that influence. But I've managed to be able to read on my reader and get to sleep no problem. So
do you yourself have sleep issues?
Yes and no. And I think it all like kind of depends on how well I'm managing my own personal stress levels. Again, my natural instinct is just my brain is constantly on the go. I'm constantly thinking about this thing I've got to do or this thing I forgot to do. So as long as I'm keeping to my own techniques of managing that, I do okay. And I personally just make sure I get tons and tons and tons of physical activity, and that helps me to keep my brain and my body just nice and cool and regulated. But when I'm not sticking to those things, yeah, I'm going to have a tougher time sleeping, but I know what things are getting in the way of that. So as long as I'm keeping those, like, my own stress levels in check, I'm doing lots of my physical activity, like, I'll usually be okay.
Now, would you say that stress is one of the biggest factors to people having trouble with sleep?
Yes and no. And especially for like my older school-aged kids, they can't always put words to it, but I suspect a lot of times it is just kind of stress built up from the day. And I've even seen that with my kids as young as like 6 and 7, where, they tell mom and dad like everything's going great at school, but they have complete meltdowns when they get home. It's just all the sensory overload. So like there's something going on. But yeah, I mean, if your stress levels are really high or even like slightly elevated, if you don't have an outlet to get rid of that stress, whether it's just having somebody to talk to, journaling, physical activity, like, yeah, that's going to be pent up. And again, I think for a lot of people who have that issue of like their mind is constantly racing, there's always something to worry about, think about, they tend to be a little bit more stressed out. So, and I see this personally, like my husband is not a stressed out person at all, but when he is stressed out, and he's an amazing sleeper, but when he's stressed out, like I can tell, I know that he's not sleeping well. He's up way, way, way too early. And, not like me. I mean, he uses meditation, and that is his that is his thing to help him manage his
Mm-hmm.
stress. And when he's doing that consistently, he does better with his sleep. But all of these things they're habits, and it's staying really consistent with those things is a challenge. And I'm saying that even as a sleep coach, like for my own personal well-being, like I know it's really hard to stay on top of like, keeping to that consistent stress management for sure.
Now, do you deal differently from ASD to ADHD clients? Do you deal with them differently, or are they all treated the same?
No, I think irregardless of diagnosis, ultimately when I work with a family or when I work with somebody, like I want to get more details as to like developmentally what's going on. As important as a diagnosis is, not every, no two people are exactly the same. And I think that's the unfortunate thing. Like so often people are just kind of boxed into like, oh, you're ASD or you're ADD, so that means blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. So like for me, when I work with somebody, I ask very detailed questions about vision and sensory and physical activity, what that child can do, what they can't do yet, and really ultimately try to design a plan based on that. And if we take two kids with ASD, like some of my kids that I work with, we got to do a lot of sensory stuff, but that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes it's just like, hey, get out for a walk a few times a week and let's do this. And, it'll keep things in check. But, that I think that's what is very exciting about what I do. Like every kid and every person is unique, and to find that right combination of things for them is a challenge and a puzzle I really like to solve. And I realize, like, sometimes I'll give somebody something and they're like, this did not work at all. Great. Okay, perfect. Well, we've got a few other things that we could try here as well. But it just amazes me that like sometimes it's the simplest things that can make the biggest impact. And I think the unfortunate thing is that for a lot of my kids and my young adults with ASD or ADD, it's just very often it's just assumed like, no, there's nothing we can do about that. It's just part of the diagnosis, like live with it. And it doesn't have to be. It really doesn't.
Who do you find is easier to work with, adults or youth?
I find kids are easier to work with just because it's parents implementing the changes. Adults, it's like, there's nobody like hanging over you saying like, you have to do this. But that being said, there's pros and cons to working with adults and kids. Like it's, they're two totally different things. But having worked with a few adults, like what I find most exciting is that like sometimes when you have all these simple things and you finally put them into play, they're like, oh my gosh, like this is working so well. I had no idea. And it's it's really nice to get somebody to that point. Again, most of what I do at working with adults is like, hey, did you do this? Are you sticking with it? Like, come on, let's go. But it can, to see that change and for my adults is really great too.
Are there any true secrets to getting a really good night's rest? Or is it just hard work?
Yeah, it takes a lot of hard work at first, but the amazing thing is that some of these things that you put into place, like you have to be consciously thinking about and keeping on top of, but the brain is amazing at learning and adapting to new sequences and those things. Like, at a certain point, it just becomes second nature. Again, like my husband last night, he came upstairs, he needed to put on a pair of flip-flops. He took off his socks and he started to like get undressed and get into his PJs. Like he just instantly, it was dark out. He wanted to just put a pair of flip-flops on, but his brain triggered into like, oh, it's bedtime routine time. So there,
Wow.
so if you do it consistently enough and you wait for that moment of like, this just becomes second nature, it doesn't feel like hard work after that. And, I think for a lot of people, when they feel those benefits and they see those benefits, you've got all the more motivation to stick with it. So if there's any trade secret, I guess, you could say is like, once you find those tools that work for you, really stick with it, be patient. Like the brain and body is going to start to pick up on those habits, and things will become second nature soon enough.
Okay. Now, what is your opinion on midday naps?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said about taking midday naps, especially for adults. Now, the timings of it, you have to be careful with. If I recommend a nap for my adults, it's usually anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes. It's like just enough for somebody to get into like that stage 1, stage 2 sleep without going through a full cycle. But depending on what your sleep is like at night, like there are some benefits to going through a full sleep cycle, but in my experience, it's those kind of power naps or those coffee naps that tend to work better for adults.
I mean, because I know I have a friend who's like me, but more severe, and he's taking antipsychotics, and the sedation effect just kicks in, and he thinks he's going to go for a short nap, but he winds up sleeping for hours.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I keep telling him, you need to talk to your doctors and dial that down, because that eventually is going to ruin your sleep habit.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to get the sleep you need.
Yeah. And I mean, we haven't even talked about medications. That obviously for a lot of people with ADD, like that can greatly affect their sleep. And I've worked with some people and some kids where it's like just reducing the amount of medication by 1 or 2 mgs, like, it was the difference between taking 4 hours to go to sleep and an hour to go to sleep. And now that being said, like, I also realized that the medications are helping with certain symptoms during the day as well. So ultimately you kind of have that hard decision of like, okay, what's just enough where I can still be okay the next day and still do what I got to do. But yeah, I mean, with medications, like it's, the side effects can be really hardcore. And I certainly, for your friend, if he's sleeping several hours during the day, that's a good indicator for me to say like, yeah, talk to the doctor. And because it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a good night's sleep. Like there is a certain amount of sleep pressure, especially for adults, that you want to build up.
Yeah. And finally, what is your ideal room setting to get a good night's sleep in?
Room setting. Well, usually one of the first things that I will do with my kids, adults alike, just because it's easy to check off the list, is, obviously you want to make sure that you have a nice dark room, so not a whole heck of a lot of light coming in. I live behind a hospital where we get a lot of light pollution, so I've taken I've taken brown grocery bags and I've like puttied those over our window in addition to a blackout curtain.
Oh wow. So the blackout curtain doesn't even work.
No, and a lot of times like there's still like an edge of light that comes in like around it, so just cover up the windows. You should be fine. And if it's a kid, you do want to make sure that they feel safe in the room, so you can always put like a little night light in there. I find that for a lot of my kids and adults with ADD, temperature is the bigger thing.
With me it is, because I know when my room starts to get hot, I need to kick off my blanket right away and let my body cool down. Otherwise, I just get like agitated, I guess you'd call it, and then I have to use my lighter blanket so my body can stay cool. Otherwise, if I start to sweat, then I just get really agitated and I start tossing more.
Well, yeah, and the issue is that I think for a lot of my kids and my adults with ADD, they tend to just body temperature wise run hotter. So like the hotter you run, the harder it is to like get into those really deep stages of sleep. So I generally recommend trying to keep the room around 68 degrees or cooler. If I could, I would absolutely keep it cooler. I'm a total polar bear. But my thermostat only goes to 68. So I keep it at that coolest level. But I've worked with kids and adults where like 64, 63 is like their ideal temperature. So even a 1 or 2 degree difference can be the difference between like really good deep quality sleep and not getting that.
Yeah, because I know usually in the house at night we have it set to around 72, 73.
Yeah.
And with me, our vent is on the roof, on the top. So
Okay.
it's blowing down on me.
Got it.
So yeah, so I'll usually in the middle of the night, once I get warm, I'll drop the temperature 1. Let the AC run so my body cools down. And sometimes I've noticed with the lighter blanket, I'll fall asleep a lot quicker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a lot of times it's just like finding that right combination of things. Now, I don't recommend these all that often, but every once in a while, especially for my adults who run really hot, it's expensive. That's why I don't recommend it too much. But the chili pad can be really helpful in just keeping like a good consistent body temperature at night.
Well, there's also a product. I'm hopefully going to be reviewing it once I email them back next month. They're a mattress company called 8 Sleep, and you've heard of them?
I think so. Yeah, I'm trying to
They've
remember when I
created
heard.
a water-cooled bed that basically the smart bed that adjusts to your body's temperature.
Interesting.
So if you're warm, it will cool down. If you're hot, if you're cold, it will warm up.
Cool. Interesting. Yeah, I think it's one of these things I probably saw on Instagram at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a sleep coach, I see all those kind of advertisements. Yeah.
But anyways, it was great talking with you and learning about sleep. I mean, I've learned more about my own sleep than I knew about. I mean, I didn't know that once my body was tired, I should just say, hey, I'm not going to fight this. I'm just going to go to sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got everything to gain and nothing to lose by doing it. And, once you start to hit those windows, it's like you start to learn a bit more about your own body's rhythm. And then once you know what that is, if you need to make adjustments because, you got to be up at 5 a.m. the next day or whatever for work, like that can happen. But you got to know exactly where your window is first, what your needs are, and then make adjustments from there.
Yeah. I mean, I remember coming home from school in England, and my parents immediately wanted me to help them with moving and everything. And we all went to bed around 9:30, and I woke up at about 1 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
So that was unusual for me to wake up that early.
Yeah. Well, again, it kind of comes back to that consistency thing. And sometimes, like when you're trying a new bedtime,
Yeah.
it is going to feel a little bit like jet lag. So be patient with it. Like, I think most of the time people kind of throw in the towel a little too soon, like maybe after 2, 3 nights, but give it a little bit more time and, things will start to even out for sure.
Yeah. I know the hardest thing for me is even in the middle of the day is to take a nap. My body my mind is just still going, and it's like I just can't get my body just to relax. I'll just lay in bed and my mind will just keep going and going and going.
Yeah. But look, I mean, even if you don't nap, sometimes just taking that, 15, 20 minutes just to like be in a dark place, let things process a little bit. That may be all that you need is like a little energy boost to keep going. So I know I will do that occasionally. I do not nap. I've never really been a big napper. but just, 15, 20 minutes just to lie down and close my eyes is, if I need it, that's usually all I need.
Well, anyways, Melissa, it was great talking with you.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. It was really great talking with you, and thank you so much for having me on.
No problem.